My first real coming across the change, so I lived in a place called Bovington, down on the south coast of England. Some of you may have heard of Bovington Tank Museum. It is possibly one of the best tank museums in the world. That's really where my passion for armoured vehicles came from, because I used to sort of, daily see these armoured vehicles trundling around the roads down there. And I decided, my family were not really a great military family. My grandfather, of course, served national service and was taken prisoner of war in the Second World War. My father also did national service. Was useless and left after about 2 years. He actually got kicked out after doing some time in prison. So I wasn't a particularly big historical military family. But I loved the armoured vehicles. So I decided to join. Now, funny enough, when I first joined the army, I was actually cat badged to the Royal Military Police. I lasted about 3 weeks with that, and I saw the training and thought, this is just not for me, so I decided that I wanted to go my first passion, which was tanks, of course. The Junior Leaders Regiment, the idea was it was supposed to be the leaders in the future, so it was like, for want of a better word, very posh boarding school for people in the not interested in the army, etc. Now, obviously, as still is the case today, you cannot serve on operational tours until you're 18 years old, so we spent 2 years just doing training. Then my first tank was the fantastic, of course, Chieftain. Chieftain was a love-hate relationship, I think, with everybody in the British Army. It was absolutely useless. And it's fair to say we spent more time fixing it, easily more time fixing it, than we ever did using it. My first ever job, really, in a Chieftain was a driver for a while. I hated it because I hated being dirty all the time, and you are dirty all the time on Chieftain. And then I went on to do gunnery on Chieftain, which gunnery really was my passion throughout my whole army career, but more about that later on. So Chieftain was, as I said, a huge love-hate relationship. The good thing about Chieftain was you could fix it yourself. Obviously nowadays the tanks, we can't really do anything as crewmen. But with Chieftain, with a bit of brown paper and string, you could do a lot of work with a Chieftain, you can make it run again. Oil, it used oil like you would not believe. We had to carry as much oil on the vehicle as we did actually inside the vehicle, topped up as we're motoring along. Unfortunately, I never saw any operations in Chieftain. Thank God for that. I mentioned a bit about the gunnery school. Now, the gunnery school in Lulworth is down towards Bovington. Again, some of you may know that there. So if you're at Bovington Tank Museum, if you carry on down that long road to nowhere, eventually you hit the sea, and that is the Lulworth Ranges. And that really, for the British armies, are a school of excellence. This is where we train everything and anything to do with gunnery. It is a fantastic training area. It is 7,000 acres, been in service since around about 1916, so obviously sort of around about the First World War. There is a lot of area there, there's a lot of hard targets on the range. We do a lot of work there with people like the SES and the Special Boat Service. Also the German Army came across quite frequently to train down there. So it's a fantastic ranges. Also down there we've also got the buildings that house the simulators. Now when I ended up doing it there, the simulator for Chieftain, as you can imagine, was about as reliable as Chieftain itself really. So that's where we do all our gunnery training. It was a funny place. I spent many years down at Lulworth because although I initially went through my gunnery training there, I then went on to join my regiment, and later on I actually went back and ended up being a gunnery instructor down there myself. So I spent 3 years down there teaching gunnery to commanders, overseas students, and members of the royal family as well. Some of the vehicles I've served on, I won't really go through all the vehicles, but perhaps the more interesting ones. Now, I've already mentioned Chieftain. Challenger 1. Challenger 1 for us, we let out a huge thank you God for everything, for giving us Challenger 1. So after Chieftain, it was absolutely amazing. But then anything would be amazing after Chieftain. It was a complete world apart for us. Integrated fire control system, reliability, which was something we never really had before, great protection, and most of all really for us, what struck us was the crew comfort. For the first time ever, we actually had things like sort of limited air conditioning, and it was absolutely fantastic. Although the one thing it did lack, as I mentioned before in Chieftain, was then became the era of really there's not a lot that the crew can do. You break down in Challenger 1 and certainly Challenger 2, there is not an awful lot you think crew can do to fix anything. It's all up to the REME, the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. With Challenger 1, obviously, I'll go on to operational services later on. I'll just go through a few more vehicles. Challenger 2 came later on, of course, for us. Challenger 2 is, of course, the best main battle tank in the world. Some would argue that the 2 M1A2, etc., etc. But of course, for us, it was the best main battle tank in the world.
I was involved in the trials actually when we first came around, looking at what tank to get, because of course not many people are aware Challenger 2 was not a definite for the British Army. When we were looking at replacing Challenger 1, there was lots of things in the pipeline, things like M1A2 Abrahams, Leopard 2, Leclerc, and a couple of others as well. So I was involved in the trials. We spent a lot of time in Greece doing trials on all these vehicles for us to find out what was the best. I wouldn't discuss that because it's another whole discussion. Challenger 2 came high on the list. I have to say though, Leopard 2 was absolutely amazing, and for us, from a gunnery point of view, because that's my speciality, we actually preferred Leopard 2 over Challenger 2 as far as the gunnery was concerned, but that's another story. But of course, politics was involved and money was involved, and Challenger 2 came with a great a system of simulators as well, which saved the British Army an awful lot of money, so we plumbed for Challenger 2. And of course, a strange name as well. I mean, why it's called Challenger 2, nobody really knows, because what, 5% of it is the same as Challenger 1, so it is a completely different vehicle. Scorpion as well. Some of you may know Scorpion, great CVRTs, of course. I served with the Armoured Reconnaissance Troop for about 2.5 years when I was in the British Army. Scorpion was a great vehicle for us. Firepower was pathetic, but of course that was not what it was intended for, and we did use it on operational service quite a few times. Also scimitar, various different guises of scimitar, and bizarrely enough, when I first joined the army for about 2 years, I was with the Guided Weapons Troop. In those days, we used to have a Guided Weapons Troop with the armoured battalions, and at the time we had swing fire. Incredibly weird. I mean, I fired, in my whole 2 years, I fired 2 rounds of swing fire, because it was just too expensive to fire. Never went anywhere with it, never did anything with it. All we did was take it on ranges, fire on 1 round, and then go back and drink lots of tea. So it was a strange thing, and funnily enough, they decided to get rid of it in the British Army later on. Operational theatres. Some of the operational theatres I've served in, again, I won't go through them all. Some of them were quite dull, to be honest. I've mentioned Northern Ireland as the first one. Now, the only reason really I mentioned Northern Ireland is because for us in the British Army, although nothing really whatsoever, I mean, you can see a picture of a Ferret Scout car there, but there wasn't really a lot of armour, of course, in Northern Ireland. But for the British Army and for a young soldier like myself, it was really our first baptism in fire. It is without any shadow of a doubt, and I even take sort of, things like Iraq and the Gulf War, etc. aside from that, one of the worst conflicts that we faced for a long, long time, probably since the war, to be fair. It went on forever, 68 to around about 98. Some would argue it's still going on in many shapes and forms today. It was a strange situation for us to be in. We lost more soldiers in my regiment in Northern Ireland than we ever did in the First Gulf War, the Second Gulf War, Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone. It was strange. It was all about terrorism, and it was, for us, obviously as tank people, in the British Army, certainly like most armies, you're trained first to be an infantry soldier. So we had to forget about our armoured vehicles, which really hurt us, and get on foot and patrol Northern Ireland. So it was a strange situation to be in. I ended up doing 14 tours of Northern Ireland. Now the tour is around about between 4 to 6 months, so 14 times I went to Northern Ireland. So I knew Northern Ireland better than I knew my hometown at the end of the day. And thank heavens it's finished. The Falklands as well. I ended up going to the Falklands. I was pulled out training quite early. The Falklands, of course, was around about sort of April 1982. To suddenly be told that Trooper Cutland, you are now going to take a Scorpion, I was actually on, to the Falklands. I didn't even know where the Falklands was. I've never heard of the Falklands. And of course, it's when Argentina decided to invade our fantastic bit of Britain way over there. I spent 6 weeks on the back of a naval ship in my Scorpion, and then sat with Gooseberry for about 2 days and didn't really see anything at all. But I mention it, of course, because for us in the British Army, it was another thing straight out of the blue. It was when we all decided that we loved Margaret Thatcher, who at the time was the most hated woman in the entire universe, but after that, everybody loved Margaret Thatcher. And again, of course, from an armoured perspective, very, very small amount of armour there. I think we had something like 3 Scorpions in the Falkland Islands, and obviously you do see quite a lot of the pictures and the paintings of that, the back for Gooseberry. A very good friend of mine actually was commanding the troop that was there. Most of the time, all we were doing really was intimate support against the infantry. The Balkans, I'm not going to go into the Balkans in great detail, but obviously Bosnia and Kosovo, it was, we used Challenger 1 and Challenger 2, of course, later on in the Balkans. For us, in an armoured perspective, it was incredibly hard because the Balkans does not lend itself well to any sort of armoured warfare. Incredibly hilly, foresty, horrible without infantry support again. We spent most of our time doing vehicle checkpoints and not much else. To be fair, the reason we were there was it looked really intimidating having a Challenger at a vehicle checkpoint as opposed to a Land Rover. So it was a very expensive way to do a really efficient checkpoint. And we did 2 tours in the end. Really for us, the first sort of test of the armoured vehicles came of course with the Gulf War I and Gulf War II. I went towards the end of the Gulf War I, but the Gulf War II my regiment was involved with completely. And of course, the second Gulf War was the real testing bed for Challenger 2. We had problems in Challenger 1 and the first Gulf War, mainly through the fact that although it had been designed to work in the desert, I mean my regiment itself, the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, was obviously a spin-off of the Desert Rat, the 7th Armoured Brigade. So we were quite used to desert operations. We had all sorts of problems in Challenger 1 with the air filter in particular. It just wasn't suited to dusty, dry and sandy conditions in the Gulf, and therefore every hour or so you'd have to stop and the poor driver would have to jump on the back decks and open the back decks and get out the air filter and bang the air filter out. Challenger 2 was fantastic. And I have to say that after serving the entire Gulf War and Challenger 2, we had a lot of respect and a lot of time for that particular vehicle. Things that were improved on there, I mean, we had no losses whatsoever, obviously, to vehicles in the Second Gulf War. We did have an IED injury where one of our drivers lost 3 toes in the end. Really for us, although of course we had experience of IEDs in the early days of Northern Ireland, it was the first time really the tanks had come into this problem of IEDs when they become incredibly sophisticated. And obviously now you've seen later on, certainly in Afghanistan, that we've got to the extent now that you could penetrate the bottom, the hulls of the main battle tanks, which was a huge problem. The biggest problem for us with tanks was other tanks, and I'm not talking enemy vehicles for us over there, it was blue on blue. Certainly, there's no Americans in the audience, is there? Certainly the Americans, I won't say too much about it, of course, but they were an impressive force to work with, as in terms of lots and lots of vehicles and lots of manpower, and that's where I'd leave it with the Americans. But the biggest threat was certainly blue on blue. At one stage, the worst damage done to my tank in the Gulf War was done by a flight of Apache helicopters from the Americans, of course, that flew over and decided that we looked incredibly like the Iraqis. I don't know how you consider a Challenger 2 in the desert looks anything like that. And on top of that, we even had a Union Jack flying from the mast. So there you go. As I said, we trusted Challenger 2 after the Gulf War. It was amazing. When we crossed the Burn from Kuwait into Iraq on the first day when the war started, my particular vehicle got engaged 36 times within the space of an hour and a half from RPGs. For me as the commander inside the vehicle, I didn't even know that we'd been engaged with RPGs until about 3 hours later, when we got out to check the tracks and the road wheels and all the rest of it, and you could see the scorch marks. That's how good the armour was and how improved it was for the Challenger 2s. Engagements, we were engaging enemy vehicles up to 4.5 kilometres away at night using the thermal images in the Gulf War and hitting them first round. It was the first time we'd used depleted uranium ammunition. We, as a regiment, knew nothing about depleted uranium. It scared the hell out of us because we had visions of obviously loading it and then 3 weeks later growing 2 heads and 14 toes and having no children and all the rest of it. But it was incredible. To see a vehicle hit with a depleted uranium round is pretty terrifying, to be fair, on the receiving end. And of course, it meant that the crews were very worried about the ammunition they were using. But Challenger 2 performed extremely well, and it was a tank that we became to love, and still do love, of course, in the British Army. That really was a massive spin through 30 years of Army service. I won't obviously go into more detail on there. It was a great time in the Army. I probably would have stayed a lot longer, but then one day I was sat in my office. At the time I was doing recruiting in the Army, which is one of the cushiest jobs ever. It was great in the middle of London, so I did nothing. I just ran a recruiting office and interviewed young soldiers, which was fantastic. And played a lot of football and drank quite a lot of beer as well. And then I got a phone call from this company called Wargaming. At the time, my wife was saying, I'd just come back from my 3rd tour of Afghanistan. I think it was my 3rd tour of Afghanistan. My wife was saying, you need to get a real job, and preferably a job where people don't shoot at you or give you a hard time. So I got a phone call from this company. It was, at the time, one of the directors who was saying that they're after a military guy, somebody who knows something about tanks in particular, to come and work for this company. Wargaming.net. I'd never heard of them. Never heard of Wargaming. They said, oh, do you play computer games? I was like, You know, I've got a teenage son, so a bit of FIFA or something on the Xbox. No, nothing like that. PC games? No, never played a PC game in my life. I thought this is not going very well, really. So they explained a bit about who they were, and they invited me over to the office in Paris, which is where the European setup is. As I said, I wasn't particularly looking for a new job, but it was the family sort of side of things. Like most armies and most soldiers, it was getting to the stage where you were certainly spending more time away on operational tours than you were at home. And I'm not a young man anymore, so it was getting quite hard work as well, to be honest. So I agreed, after much kerfuffle and much discussion with them, to go and work for this company called Wargaming. That's their mission. It's all about leisurely online games globally with passion. Does anybody not know anything at all about sort of World of Tanks or Wargaming? That's really good, actually. There's like 3 people, I think, that have never heard of it. For itself, I mean, all it is obviously the majority of the audience know they're a massive multiplayer game. Okay, so it's an online game, basically using tanks. It is an award-winning online game by a Belarusian company. The CEO, of course, is Victor Kisley. Incredible guy, incredibly intelligent guy, as you can imagine, who actually came up with the idea and started to develop the game. It is the leader in the free-to-play online game market. We've currently, as we stand, we've got well over 3,000 now, it's a bit out of date now, 3,000 people working for the company, North America, Europe, Russia, Asia, and Australia as well. Player-wise, last time I looked, it was in excess of 70-something million registered users across the world, which is a massive for any sort of game. It's in the Guinness Book of Records for most people playing online at once. Of course, that's in Russia, because they are crazy on it. And I have to say, the first time I really realised the scope of this game was when I visited Minsk, which is where the head office is. And I would put the company online branding-wise with sort of Coca-Cola, really, on the one hand. Everybody in Minsk knows wargaming, and in fact, in some of the shops in Minsk, you can play with, there's a thing called gold in-game, where you can buy some better tanks and things for your tanks and that. You can actually pay in the shops in Minsk with online gold. It's a crazy thing, but everybody in Minsk had heard of World of Tanks. I said the trilogy really is the mid-20th century, so we concentrate really on the Second World War. We have got World of Warplanes. I won't talk too much about World of Warplanes, and also soon to be released is World of Warships as well, which we think will be incredibly popular. So very similar games to World of Tanks, but obviously dealing with planes on one hand and warships on the other. The big thing really, the reason I went to it was nothing about the game whatsoever. It was their passion for history. As I said, my passion has always been history. And whilst my latter years in the army, I used to teach history in a lot of schools around London. And the problem we've always had with history is, and certainly for young people, is history is not interesting when you're teaching it. And to make history interesting is quite a task. You have to be a good teacher and a passionate teacher to make history interesting. And it was my aim to try and make younger people, certainly, interested in history. Now, obviously, everybody in this audience is passionate about history, and that's great. But to promote history, and history is incredibly important to prevent, the mistakes we've made in the past, etc., from happening, we have to encourage young people to have the same sort of passion as you have got for history. And I think the company goes a long way to help in this task, and I'll show you why in a minute. Historical accuracy for the game as well. Now, the players amongst you would argue about historical accuracy, and I'm not going to go into the gaming debate and all the rest of it. But they do go to a lot of work, and a small part of my job is obviously to do the research for the game. We talk to a lot of museums, a lot of historical consultants, and we do go to incredible lengths and a lot of money to make sure that our in-game vehicles, when you're really bored at night, the ones that never seen, you can go online and have a look at what they look like. To make sure they're as realistic and as accurate as possible to penetration values and armour values, etc. So a lot of time, a lot of effort, and an awful lot of money is invested in this. I, about 6 months ago, spent quite a time in Jordan. We were recording in Jordan armoured vehicles over there to put them in game. With the King of Jordan, which I knew from Sandhurst, so I was quite lucky. And the idea was to make it as authentic and as true to historical value as possible. Mentioning a bit about the history part of it, again, part of my job, obviously a lot of the team's job, certainly the community side of it, is the passion for the players. Now, I have to say that when I first joined the company, I went to my first community event, and I remember it vividly, sort of 3 years ago now. It was at Munster, in the Tank Museum in Munster. It was our first offline event for the company. We didn't know what to expect. We put on the forums, there's this big thing where the players talk to each other on the forums online. And we invited people to come and meet us, and myself and one German guy from the community team turned up at Munster expecting, I don't know, 10 or 15 players to come and say hello, and we had some t-shirts, rubbish like that, to give them as well. We got there and there were 300 people waiting for us, and it was the first indication really that, my God, this is actually quite popular, this game. This picture you may recognise, and certainly one of the members of this picture is sat in the audience somewhere. He's hiding. The community, we do love our community, and there's a bit of, again, a love-hate relationship with the World Tanks players. They give us a hard time because of the game, of course, because nothing's ever perfect. But the one good thing about it, if you look at just this one sort of average group, is you can see the average age on there, and there's a lot of children that play the game as well. All of them ended up coming to the museum and afterwards having a look around there. And we have spoke to many museums who say that your players know so much about tanks, it's absolutely unbelievable. So we have made that part of history interesting again, because they enjoy playing the game, therefore they get a passion for the vehicles in game, therefore they start to look at it in more detail, therefore they learn about the people that perhaps crewed them, about the war and the general bigger picture. So it's a way to get a link to certainly younger people. So the World Tanks community is fantastic. My part in meeting them, well, really all they do is talk to me about what it's like to be in a real tank. What's it like to drive? Obviously you do get a few of the the bone questions, like have you ever shot your body and all that sort of thing. So I just run away whenever I need those questions. I already mentioned before we work in museums and things. We are the last count we were working with just under 100 museums, and that was just Europe. We also work with a lot, obviously in Asia, Australia, and also in Russia, although the Russian side of business tends to deal with it themselves there. Private collectors, archives and research, charity and historical accuracy. I mentioned the historical accuracy. The first museum I ever worked with for the company was Bobbington Tank Museum, and that became our flagship museum. Mr. Smith, the director down there, Richard Smith, we managed to persuade him quite nicely that we could do a lot for his museum, and we did. And when I say a lot, we put a lot of people through the doors of a museum. Like most museums, I'm afraid I've visited an awful lot now over the last 3 years. They struggle for money, they struggle for a lot of things. And it's all about getting money through people through the door and therefore ticket sales. We increased ticket sales dramatically. A good indication perhaps would be the Swedish Tank Museum, where we managed to get through advertising online and forums and having community meets there. We got more people in one day into their museum than they managed to get in a year, which was fantastic for them. We were really pleased for them. We do lots of things with museums. An indication of the Bobbington one was we paid for the education centre. Sounds quite grand, it's really a room that's got computers in it, but it's a wargaming.net education centre. It's not to play the game, and we were adamant it's not really to do anything with us. It's just for children, young people. There were a lot of students go down to Bobbington to go through there and to actually use it as a safe room. Funnily enough, the biggest problem they had down there with all the schools that were going through there, they had nowhere that they could actually sit them down and talk to them as students, believe it or not. So we agreed that we would pay for this room. It's been incredibly popular. We've had something like 23,000 children through there in the last 18 months using it, that facility. So it was good, it's something we could do again. Also at Bobbington, we are doing a lot of restoration work with Bobbington. We gave them a donation last year, year after. Quite a large donation. This is helping go towards the restoration of quite a lot of their vehicles. We're looking at doing more work down there. I've got a bit of a video to show you a bit about Bobbington later on, but it was our first flagship one. They sell our merchandise and things, so it's sort of a give and take situation down there. But it shows, I think, and for me it sold the company, that their passion for history and how much they want to help. So it's not all about making money, and I'm not going to stand here and lie and say that they do not make money. They do make money, but obviously it's, without making that money they cannot do things like this as well. The research side of it, there's just a snapshot there of actually 4202. This is some of the research that we get up to. It is incredibly detailed. We've now got our own team that do 3D scanning as well, a Russian team that go across the museums and do it. We used to go to museums and spend about 3 solid days with a tape measure, a notebook, measuring things and a really crap gauge to measure the armour thickness, etc. What we were doing in 3 days, this team now can do in about 3 minutes with this 3D scanner. So it's incredibly impressive and really accurate. The archives and research, we have a multitude, thousands now of contacts across the globe where we speak to private collectors, archives, and we gather information, we buy information. We're doing quite an exciting project at the moment, hopefully with Bobbington, where we're looking at doing a process where they've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of images, photographs and archive data that has never even been looked at since it was piled into this room, which is about twice the size of this. Over the years, so we're going to hopefully work with them and we're going to develop some software we can try and make some semblance of order. It's quite an exciting project if you're into history because there are photos there that have never been seen by anybody but the person that took that photo, and there is some amazing stuff down there. Charities as well, we do deal with different charities across the globe. Really the one for us was Europe. That was me who managed to persuade them to do War Child. You may not have heard of War Child, but for us War Child was... The Americans were doing a veterans, the American side of the business do a veterans charity, which they were giving money to a veterans association, which is absolutely fantastic. Obviously, when you're dealing with Europe, it was incredibly hard for us. You know, you can't really do veterans when we've got German veterans, Polish veterans, French veterans, English veterans. It wasn't quite as easy and straightforward. So I looked, for about a year I spent looking at sort of charities. I came across War Child because it's something I'd worked with when I was actually in Sierra Leone. A great charity that deals just purely with children, so we made quite a large donation to them and we do some marketing and that sort of work with them as well. So that was our chosen charity really. Projects. We're at the stage now in the company where we get lots and lots and lots of people asking, mostly for money of course, but coming to us, and it's quite a hard thing to sift through what is, you know, it's all worthwhile stuff. The trouble is there's only a finite amount of help that people can give, but it is fascinating and it's great stuff that you can do there. Another big one, of course, was the Spitfire project. I don't know if anybody heard about that, where we actually ended up going to Burma looking for buried Spitfires. There weren't any. That's what I'm going to say about that. Ultimately, it all boils down to one thing for me personally, and that was that love of armour. Other things I do, I mean, it's been fantastic. Since I left the British Army, I've had a chance to drive so many different vehicles and mess around with different vehicles. I even drove the Tiger 131. I mean, I would have been a happy man if I had died on that day. But for me, it's great. So all I do is I travel around. I do a lot of reports and things for the forums as well. I make these videos that some of you may see. It's the worst thing for me, obviously not being somebody who's ever been in front of the camera before to make these videos, but they are popular with the community. And all it is about selling it and making everything interesting and accessible to everybody, not just historians or researchers, but people who've got genuine love and trying to make history exciting once again. As I said before, there are bonuses, of course, to being a tanky and working for a computer gaming company. I apologise to you, madam. But the bonuses, of course, when you are working in this, I don't spend all my time sat in dusty old archives looking at information anymore. I go to things like Gamescom, which is great. And obviously, there's some of the bonuses that you get at places like Gamescom. Again, this side of the business is, for me, to see that coming from my background, to see what goes on at these sort of, computer exhibitions, gaming exhibitions, is incredible. But once again, what it is doing is getting millions and millions of people interested in, a very simple computer game, and ultimately some of those will go on to get a passion for history and become the historians and lovers of history of the future. So that really is me there. Incredible sprinter, I know, and incredibly fast. But has anybody got any questions really about anything? I'm happy to answer anything if I can. Unless it's about matchmaking or something to do with the game. Or no questions? Yes, sir.
It's quite obvious that you are in love with the challenge too. So how much have you picked up the qualities of the tank in the world of tanks?
Tweaked it up?
Yeah.
Well, because I'm sure you're aware that I do the research, I'm not a developer. Therefore, I have very little impact. No, not at all, not at all. There's always this thing, again, if you don't play the game, there's always this this Russian bias. Everybody talks about Russian bias and all the Russian tanks are better than everybody else's and all this sort of thing. all I can say is that from my part of the job in the company is I'm lucky, I do the easy part. I do the research and I find out statistics, armour values, penetration values, etc, etc. I say it's easy, it takes a lot of time, it's relatively straightforward. It then goes to the developers, and the developers are sort of a group of men that live in a hole in the ground somewhere. Incredibly clever, never see the daylight. But what they have to do is what's called balancing. Now, everybody who plays computer games hates that name, balancing. All it means is the idea, of course, is that you can't have, I don't know, take a Tiger One for example. A Tiger One is better than X amount of other vehicles. Therefore, when you're playing a game against each other, if it's not balanced correctly, that vehicle is going to win every game, and everybody will always play that one particular vehicle. So they do this thing called balancing, and it's never popular with the players because obviously you lose some of that historical accuracy when you come on there. So I would of course love to make the British tech tree better than any other tech tree whatsoever, but it didn't happen by a long way, of course. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I understood that you're quite popular in the former Soviet, today's Russia. But I was wondering, do you have any statistics on the European countries? I mean, for example, per capita or compared to the population, in which European country are you placed most?
I mean, it changes a lot, but at the moment, as far as Europe's concerned, for the first time ever, we're actually getting up to, we're not that far away from the Russian players, I'll be honest, at the moment, as far as everything's concerned, the whole of Europe.
The whole.
But Europe in general, the biggest player base within Europe is Poland. Very, very passionate people, the Polish, no comments. You've also got German community, quite large, as far as World Tanks. After that then, there's not really a lot of divide from it. I mean, I could tell you the lower ones. I mean, the lower ones are the United Kingdom, some of the Baltic regions, not particularly great. But certainly at the top, the German and Polish at the moment. And I could give you, I'm quite happy to share figures. I haven't got them with me, but I'll give you plain figures. It's not a huge problem.
No, that's fine.
Yes, sir.
Questions, I don't know much about this.
No such thing as a stupid question.
Easy question, but this weather tank, so how many different types of tanks?
Oh my god, 300 and something now, different types of vehicles in the game, so an awful lot. And what they're doing, they're forever working on new vehicles to bring it together. So, yeah, I think it's 312, but don't quote me on that please, because I'm probably wrong. So an awful lot of vehicles. It works in tech tree. They do things called tech tree, so the Germans, the British, etc., etc. So they're forever developing new vehicles, bring them out, etc.
So it's not only about 1.2.
It should have been. It's starting to stray a little bit nowadays. It's getting a bit later, to be fair. Some of the vehicles that are coming into play. So it was predominantly supposed to be that sort of that era. Predominantly. Many of the players were asked a lot whether we're ever going to bring in things like, I don't know, Chieftain. We are bringing in a prototype, but you know, later Chieftains, Challenger 1, Challenger 2, that sort of thing. From a gameplay, it just doesn't work. We're then getting to the realms of stupidity when you've got a Challenger 2 facing a Sherman. So if it ever happened within the company, it will be a completely new game, with using new vehicles and different terrains and bigger maps. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.